Leave it here.
Think your grocery bill is high? Wild West workers had it worse. They had to stay alive on whatever they could hunt, gather, or pack in a wagon. These 15 cheap meals weren't fancy, but they kept generations fed through drought, gunfights, and endless hard work. And at the top of that list, beans with salt pork. Ever had a food that showed up at every single meal? That's basically what beans were to Wild West workers, except they actually wanted them around. This legendary combination was the ultimate survival food of the American frontier, simmering endlessly over campfires like the world's most reliable dinner. Beans with salt pork weren't just any food, they were the food. The cornerstone of frontier nutrition and the original set-it-and-forget-it meal. Unlike our modern quick dinners that disappear after one sitting, beans were a deliberate lifestyle, a practical solution to the harsh realities of life on the range, in mining camps, and along cattle drives. At their core, beans were simply dried legumes that stayed edible for months without refrigeration. What went into the bean pot? The base typically consisted of pinto beans, navy beans, or whatever variety was cheapest at the trading post, boiled until soft, then flavored with a small chunk of salt pork. One study of frontier camp remains found that the average cowboy consumed beans at least twice daily. That's over 700 bean meals per year. During cattle drives, chuck wagon cooks kept their bean pots going for days, adding water and more beans as the crew ate their fill. The salt pork made all the difference. This wasn't bacon as we know it today. Salt pork was fatty pork belly preserved in heavy salt, packed in barrels that could survive months on the trail. A single 2-inch cube could flavor an entire pot of beans, providing precious fat and salt that hard-working men desperately needed. The cooking method was beautifully simple. Soak dried beans overnight. In the morning, drain them, add fresh water, toss in your chunk of salt pork, and set the pot near the fire. Let it simmer all day while you work. By evening, dinner was ready. Some chuck wagon cooks became legendary for their bean recipes. A pinch of wild sage, some foraged wild onions, or a splash of molasses could transform basic beans into something men actually looked forward to eating. The downside? Frontier camps were notoriously fragrant places. One old saying claimed you could tell which way the wind was blowing by listening to the cowboys complain. But beans with salt pork kept the West moving. Railroad workers, gold miners, cattle drivers, and homesteaders all survived on this humble combination. Beans may have been the backbone of frontier meals, but they weren't the only thing that kept workers going. Another staple appeared at nearly every meal, though calling it food might be generous. Could a food be both indestructible and barely edible? Hardtack proved the answer was yes. These rock-hard biscuits earned nicknames like tooth dullers, sheet iron, and worm castles. Hardtack was brutally simple. Flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, cut into squares, and baked until all moisture evaporated. The result was a cracker so hard it could survive years without spoiling. The hardness wasn't a flaw. It was the point. Without refrigeration, most foods spoiled within days. Hardtack lasted indefinitely. Supply wagons carried barrels that might be months or even years old. Eating hardtack required strategy. Biting directly into one could crack a tooth. Most men soaked hardtack in coffee, water, or bean juice until it softened enough to chew. Some fried it in bacon grease, others crumbled it into stews. Coffee became hardtack's essential partner. Strong, bitter frontier coffee served multiple purposes. It woke you up, warmed you up, and most importantly, it softened your hardtack. Cowboys and miners consumed coffee in quantities that would horrify modern doctors. Frontier coffee bore little resemblance to today's carefully crafted brews. Chuck wagon cooks made it by boiling water, dumping in ground coffee beans, and letting it steep until it turned black as tar. One cowboy claimed good trail coffee should be strong enough to float a horseshoe. The combination of hardtack and coffee became a frontier ritual. Morning started with coffee and hardtack dunked until edible. Midday breaks featured more of the same. Hardtack had one notorious problem: weevils. These small beetles laid eggs in flour, and their larvae thrived in stored hardtack. Hungry men learned to tap their hardtack against the table, knocking out the weevils before eating. In desperate times, they didn't bother. Extra protein, they joked darkly. Despite its many flaws, hardtack saved lives. When supply lines failed, when hunting came up empty, when every other food source disappeared, hardtack remained. While hardtack kept men alive, it didn't keep them happy. When flour was fresh and a cook had time, something far better appeared on frontier tables. Sourdough flapjacks were the closest thing to luxury that most frontier workers ever tasted. These pancakes required just 3 ingredients: sourdough starter, flour, and water. Sourdough starter was liquid gold on the frontier. This bubbling mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast could live indefinitely if fed regularly. Miners carried starter in pouches close to their bodies to keep it warm. Chuck wagon cooks guarded their starter like treasure. The beauty of sourdough was its self-sufficiency. Unlike modern baking that requires store-bought yeast, sourdough captured wild yeast from the air. Once established, a starter could last decades. Making flapjacks was simple. Mix sourdough starter with flour and water until you get a pourable batter. Heat a greased pan over the fire. Pour circles of batter and flip when bubbles appeared. The taste was distinctly tangy, nothing like modern pancakes. But after days of beans and hardtack, sourdough flapjacks tasted like heaven. Men ate them plain, or if lucky, with a drizzle of molasses. Flapjacks provided crucial variety in the monotonous frontier diet. Sunday mornings often featured flapjacks, giving workers something to look forward to after 6 days of hard labor. Mining camps and cattle drives developed hierarchies around sourdough quality. A cook known for excellent flapjacks could command higher wages. Men would switch employers for better breakfast. Flapjacks required relatively fresh flour, but another grain-based meal could be made from even the cheapest, coarsest ingredients available. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounds like. Boiled cornmeal in water, cooked until thick, eaten hot or cold. It wasn't exciting, but it was cheap, filling, and required almost no skill to prepare. Cornmeal cost less than wheat flour and grew in conditions where wheat failed. A single bag of cornmeal could feed a man for weeks if stretched properly. The basic recipe couldn't be simpler. Boil water, slowly stir in cornmeal while whisking to prevent lumps, cook until thick. Hot mush was breakfast food. Workers ate it plain, or with a splash of milk if available, or with molasses if they were lucky. Cold mush had a second life. Once cooled and solidified, it could be sliced and fried. These fried mush slices became a side dish for other meals, or portable food that workers could carry into the fields. Cornmeal mush stretched further than almost any other food. A single cup of dry cornmeal, cooked with water, expanded to feed multiple people. During economic depressions and crop failures, mush kept families alive when nothing else was available. The nutritional value was limited. People who ate primarily cornmeal developed pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency. Thousands of poor Southerners suffered from pellagra in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Despite its limitations, cornmeal mush remained a frontier staple. It was reliable, cheap, and required minimal cooking equipment. When even basic ingredients like cornmeal ran low, frontier workers turned to true scrap cooking, using every bit of food that might otherwise be thrown away. Scrap stew was the ultimate waste-nothing meal. Bones with bits of meat still clinging to them, vegetable peels, stale bread crusts, bacon grease, anything remotely edible went into the pot. Frontier life left no room for waste. When food was scarce and money scarcer, throwing away anything edible was unthinkable. The cooking method was simple. Keep a pot simmering near the fire constantly. Toss in scraps throughout the day. Bones from yesterday's meal, potato peels, the tough outer leaves of cabbage. By evening, you had something resembling soup. Bones played a starring role. After eating meat, frontier workers saved every bone. These bones went into the stew pot where they simmered for hours, releasing marrow and whatever meat scraps remained. Some bones were used multiple times, boiled until they literally fell apart. Stale bread found new life in scrap stew. Hardtack too old even for dunking. Bread gone moldy on the edges, biscuits dried to rocks. All of it went into the pot where moisture softened it back to edibility. Mining camps and railroad construction sites often had communal scrap pots. Workers contributed whatever they had, and everyone ate from the shared pot. When actual vegetables were available, even cheap ones, frontier meals improved dramatically. Potatoes and onions were the working man's vegetables. Both grew easily, stored well, and cost little. Together they made a stew that was simple, filling, and actually tasted like something. Potatoes thrived in frontier conditions. They grew in poor soil, produced heavy yields, and could be stored in root cellars for months. The stew recipe was straightforward. Chop potatoes and onions, add water, boil until the potatoes were soft. Season with salt if you had it. Improvements included adding a bit of bacon grease for fat or wild herbs for variety. The result was a thick, hearty stew that actually satisfied. Unlike thin broths or watery mush, potato and onion stew had substance. Frontier workers ate this stew regularly, especially during winter when other vegetables weren't available. It appeared on tables from Montana mining camps to Texas ranches. Potatoes provided crucial calories. Men doing heavy work could easily eat 5 or 6 potatoes in a single meal, providing over 600 calories just from potatoes. While potato and onion stew required fresh vegetables, another frontier staple could be made from ingredients that lasted indefinitely. Sourdough bread was the staff of life on the frontier. Unlike flapjacks, which were a breakfast treat, sourdough bread was serious business. It accompanied every meal, soaked up stews, and could be eaten alone when nothing else was available. Frontier ovens varied wildly. Chuck wagons had built-in Dutch ovens. Mining camps might have a communal stone oven. Some workers had nothing but a covered pot buried in coals. The bread itself was dense and chewy. Frontier bread was meant to fill you up and last for days. A single loaf might be eaten over 3 or 4 days, growing progressively harder but remaining edible if dunked in coffee or stew. Workers ate enormous quantities of bread. A man doing hard physical labor might consume a pound or more of bread daily. Bread provided the bulk of daily calories for most frontier workers. Bread also served as a plate. Thick slices could hold stew, beans, or other wet foods. After eating the topping, you ate the bread that had absorbed all the juices. While plain sourdough bread was standard, adding one simple ingredient transformed it into something special. Cornbread with molasses was the frontier's version of dessert. The cornbread itself was simple and cheap. The molasses added sweetness that made hard lives a little more bearable. Cornbread required just cornmeal, water, a bit of fat, and salt. Mixed together and baked in a hot pan, it produced a dense, crumbly bread. Unlike wheat bread, cornbread required no rising time. Mix it and bake it. Molasses was the magic ingredient. This thick, dark syrup was a byproduct of sugar refining, making it much cheaper than actual sugar. A jug of molasses lasted months and provided the only sweetness many frontier workers ever tasted. Drizzling molasses over warm cornbread created a simple but satisfying treat. The sweetness contrasted with the corn's natural flavor. Workers ate cornbread with molasses as a special breakfast or as an evening treat after a hard day. Children especially loved this simple treat. In families where candy and sweets were unknown luxuries, cornbread with molasses was the highlight of the week. When meat was available, even in small amounts, frontier cooks found ways to stretch it as far as possible. Jerky stew turned a few strips of dried meat into a meal that could feed several people. Jerky was expensive, but a little went a long way when cooked properly. Jerky was meat's answer to hardtack. Thin strips of beef, venison, or other meat were salted heavily and dried in the sun or over smoke. The result was a leathery, nearly indestructible food that could last for months. Eating jerky straight was challenging. It was tough, salty, and required serious chewing. But rehydrated in stew, jerky softened and released its flavor into the cooking liquid. The stew method was simple. Break jerky into small pieces. Add water and let it soak for an hour. Then add whatever vegetables you had and simmer until everything was tender. A few ounces of jerky could flavor a pot large enough to feed 4 or 5 men. This efficiency made jerky stew a practical way to add meat to the diet without the expense of fresh meat. Hunters and trappers made their own jerky from game animals. Deer, elk, antelope, even bear could be turned into jerky. This homemade jerky cost nothing but time and labor. When workers had time and opportunity, they could supplement their basic rations with foods gathered from the land itself. Foraged stew combined whatever could be hunted or gathered with whatever staples were on hand. Rabbit, wild onions, berries, and anything else edible went into the pot. Small game was everywhere on the frontier. Rabbits, squirrels, prairie dogs, and birds could be caught with simple traps or shot with a rifle. Rabbit was the most common foraged meat. A single rabbit provided enough meat for a small pot of stew. The meat was lean and mild, accepting whatever flavors were cooked with it. Wild onions grew across the frontier. They were smaller and stronger than cultivated onions, but free for the taking. Workers learned to recognize the distinctive smell and appearance. Berries added both flavor and nutrition to forage stews. While we think of berries as sweet treats, frontier cooks often added them to savory stews where their tartness balanced rich meat flavors. Wild greens were abundant in spring and summer. Dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters, purslane, and dozens of other plants provided free vegetables. Workers learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Forage stew required knowledge and effort, but no money. For workers who were broke but had time, foraging provided real food security. When fresh meat wasn't available, another preserved option provided protein for those who could afford it. Dried salt beef was a step up from jerky. Chunks of beef were heavily salted and dried, creating a preserved meat that could last for months in a barrel or sack. The pieces were larger and thicker than jerky. A chunk of salt beef the size of your fist could add real meat to a pot of stew. Like jerky, salt beef required rehydration before eating. The meat was soaked in water to remove some of the salt, then boiled until tender. This process took hours, but the result was actual meat. Salt beef was more expensive than jerky. Workers bought it when they could afford it, usually after payday. It was a treat, not an everyday food. Chuck wagon cooks on cattle drives often had barrels of salt beef. They used it to add protein to the crew's meals, knowing that men doing exhausting work needed substantial food. For workers constantly on the move, portable food that didn't require cooking was essential. Cowboy trail mix wasn't the granola and chocolate version we know today. It was a practical combination of dried foods that could be eaten while riding, working, or traveling. Jerky, hardtack pieces, dried fruit when available, and sometimes nuts. The concept was simple. Combined foods that wouldn't spoil, didn't need cooking, and provided quick energy. Workers carried trail mix in saddlebags, pockets, or small pouches. Cowboys on long cattle drives relied heavily on trail mix. When you're riding for 14 hours straight, you can't stop for a sit-down meal. Grabbing a handful from your saddlebag kept you going. Trail mix also served as emergency rations. If you got separated from your crew, lost in unfamiliar territory, or stranded by weather, the trail mix in your pocket might be all that kept you alive. When even basic ingredients were available, frontier cooks could create simple breads that required minimal equipment. Fry bread was quick, simple, and required only a pan and some fat. Flour, water, salt, and a bit of fat mixed into a dough, flattened and fried until golden. The cooking method was faster than baking. Heat fat in a pan, flatten a piece of dough, and fry it for a few minutes on each side. Within 10 minutes, you had fresh bread. Fried bread was best eaten immediately while still warm. The crispy exterior and soft interior made it more interesting than plain baked bread. It could be eaten alone, used to scoop up beans or stew, or topped with molasses. The fat used for frying varied. Bacon grease was common and added flavor. The fat was often reused multiple times, taking on flavors from everything cooked in it. When flour ran low and proper bread became impossible, frontier workers turned to an even more primitive option. Ash cakes were the last line of defense against starvation. Mix whatever ground meal you had with water, flatten it, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No pan, no oven, just fire and desperation. The cooking method was primitive, but effective. Rake hot coals to the side, place your flattened dough directly on the hot ashes, cover it with more hot ashes, and wait. After 10 to 15 minutes, brush off the ashes and you had bread. The taste was smoky, often bitter, and frequently gritty with actual ash. But they provided calories when nothing else was available. Ash cakes could be made from any ground grain. Cornmeal was common, wheat flour if you had it. Even ground acorns or other foraged foods could be turned into ash cakes during truly desperate times. Frontier workers made ash cakes when they were traveling light and couldn't carry cooking equipment. Prospectors heading into the mountains with minimal gear relied on ash cakes. Despite their many drawbacks, ash cakes saved lives. When supply lines failed, when hunting came up empty, when every other option was exhausted, ash cakes remained possible. The final meal on our list wasn't really a meal at all, but rather a philosophy of frontier eating. The chuck wagon leftovers meal was whatever remained from previous meals, mixed together and served as something new. Yesterday's beans, this morning's biscuits, last night's stew, all combined into a dish that was different every time. This approach wasn't laziness, it was practical genius. On the frontier, wasting food was unthinkable. Every scrap had value. Chuck wagon cooks became masters of leftover transformation. Stale biscuits were crumbled into stews to thicken them. Leftover beans were fried with onions. Cold cornbread was mixed with new ingredients. Workers rarely complained about leftover meals. They understood the reality of frontier life. Food was precious. Cooks who could stretch supplies and prevent waste were valued members of any crew. The leftover philosophy extended beyond just mixing foods. Cooking liquids were saved and reused. Bacon grease was stored and used for frying. Some of the best frontier meals came from creative leftover combinations. A skilled cook could take 3 days of mediocre meals and transform them into something that actually tasted good. The chuck wagon leftover meal represented the ultimate frontier value. Waste nothing, use everything, and make it work. These 15 cheap meals built the American West. From beans and hardtack to forage stews and leftover combinations, frontier workers survived on food that was simple and practical. These humble meals provided the fuel for incredible human achievement.